I wanted to talk just for a few minutes about training the mind and how we overcomplicate our lives because we have minds that are untrained. And so I'll start with a complicated thing like race, um, or identifications of any kind. So something as complicated as racial relations in the world, whether we're talking about minority groups in China, um, or we're talking about African American people in America and white people, or we're talking in Europe about different racial relations. And so at some point, we develop this racial identity. Some of us have it to more or less of a degree, and uh, surprisingly, there's very few of us who do not have that identity, meaning the fabric of ourself is not actually composed of a racial component. And so that's where I fall into um, the non identification. Now, I have entered into several arguments about why racial identification is important, and it seems to me that most of the arguments are from confusion, from a source of not understanding their own mind. And one of the confusions is to think that what other people think of you um, should help you define yourself, your sense of self. And I think that that is based on a fallacy around the idea that you have this sense of self and that it is real and solid. And it is also um, mistaken because, I mean, I'll put it like this: when you look at the mind closely and you see what happens with something like race, and this is missing from the conversation, there isn't a policy that could take away any of these issues from people's heart mind because of the way their thoughts and feelings and narratives have spun them into these identifications. It doesn't mean that this, in no way am I saying that you could go and just stop identifying. In fact, it will be a process. But people have glamorized the process. So if you look at, let's say, anti-racist, um, there is a claim in from some of those people that race should exist as a category, and then racists, there's a claim of some of those people who think that it should exist as a category, and within that claim, there's delusion that they're not able to see, and so if you and there's also delusion in trying to create policies that make it seem that such issues are not present. So by taking off the race part on a survey, it it only serves the belief that society need not have individuals who liberate themselves, but in fact society needs these rules or to be able to be correct morally. And that's a confused view. And what I mean by that is that identification alone can not be transcended by policy. It must be transcended by individuals. And in a way, some people who are advocating for dealing with, let's say, gender or racial trauma are advocating for the right thing, but I think it becomes too complicated because racial trauma becomes a special trauma. There is nothing special about any type of trauma, rather that's rape, race, gender, or sexism, or any type of physical violence. There isn't anything, because the elements we really care about at the atomistic level is thoughts arising, feelings arising, perceptions arising. And when you meditate, when you really look inwards, and it doesn't have to be any special form of meditation, it could just be you laying there on your bed and imagining and seeing thoughts and focusing back on something. For me, it's my breath most of the time, coming back to my breath. And you're actually able to see how these things emerge. You could even bring a picture. If you consider yourself a racist, you can bring a picture of someone that you feel triggered by. And if you are apt enough, you can sit with that picture and watch your mind. And you'll begin to see that there are holes in your identity that you weren't aware of, and you'll also begin to see this kind of fleeting, this simulation of a stream of consciousness. Like it's a simulation that there's continuity between thought and thought and thought. And so the problem with someone who is racist is also the same problem that someone who is anti-racist and feels like a victim of race, is that they have thoughts about race, and they have feelings about race, and they have perceptions about race. And so if we say trauma is some sort of connected bodily feeling mixed with narrative, we're still dealing with the same basic components. It is not special in any way. And so then our approach to it is to really look deeply. And when I say that, it's like, what does really mean? Well, in this case, it means developing a non-evaluative awareness and observing through that lens. And what would be the opposite of that? It would be judging each thought. So a thought comes up, oh, there's another race thought. Or there's another sexist thought. Ah, oh, darn, I'm a bad person. That's not going to unlock it for you. Although, if you listen to some anti-racists and some racists, they seem to be conflicted between each other because they are using either morality as a way to be righteous and indignant, rather than taking out the actual problem. So we sit there, and you can just do this now. Breathe in and try to remember, if you feel you're somewhat prejudiced, the last person you were really prejudiced against. Maybe you acted, maybe it was just a thought, maybe it was just a feeling. And allow your mind to open up and focus on your breath, and imagine your mind as a stream, and allow these thoughts, feelings to come through. And so if you take that out, since I don't have time to go through all of that, and you do that daily, you begin to see the makeup of racism. And when you see that, or whatever it is, and you see that, you actually find out it's much less complicated than people are actually making it, because it exists in the mind first. And so there are thoughts and there are feelings. And when you begin to observe those thoughts, you notice some of the contradictory nature of it. You notice the lack of continuity. You begin to notice that you are not your thoughts as well, right? That is a consequence of of just literally observing yourself this way, that the illusion of yourself, as it begins to melt away, you start to see the illusory nature of these social constructs. It doesn't mean that you'll instantly become not a racist, but you can melt these ideas because of this deep looking. And it is that approach that will successfully move you from either racist or feeling like you're a victim, deeply identified with your race. Um, and you'll start to see that all of that falls apart, and a thought arises: that person's looking at me this way because of that. That's a thought. And usually there's a feeling attached to it. It can come before, or it can come after. Or if you're racist, or if you have a prejudiced mind, it's not that you're racist or you're an anti-racist. It's not possible to be either of those. It's possible to take a conceptual position on those, but it's not actually possible because your mind is not like that. It's this kind of rising and falling, this process playing itself out. And you could say there are habits that look racist, but you can't actually say that a person is racist. So when I was saying that earlier, I was just using that as a conversational tool to help you understand this. But in reality, when you begin to look at it and you develop this nuanced, intimate understanding of yourself, and that the fact that there is no self, then slowly you see that the makeup of what you thought was racism was a couple of thoughts here and there, a couple of feelings here and there, and that those thoughts could be when you're meditating, but it could also be when you're interacting with others. And when you have this non-evaluative awareness that is looking out for you, you begin to melt the idea of that those thoughts are true, and that you shouldn't, that you don't need to believe them. And it's not like oh, I don't need to believe those. It's not like a self-help prep it up. Oh yeah, those thoughts are just invisible or delusional. Blah 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 blah. No, this comes from experience of just looking, not evaluating what you're looking at. This is where intelligence, there's a non-verbal intelligence of the heart mind that is not developed through logic, although you can develop discernment through logic, which is fine to some extent. But this non-verbal heart mind is seeing those thoughts occur in you, seeing those feelings occur to you, and then being able to notice the fiction of it, because you watch it rise and you want to kind of you feel yourself magnetized towards that thought, and you're fully identified with it. You're like, I am this thought. Like that person's really looking at me like that. And then slowly, as you meditate, I believe you begin to slowly back off of that, and it's more like you're the awareness of that thought. Because who's looking at that thought? Who? Who is it? Aren't you the one saying the thought? But no, you seem to be observing the thought. That's strange, because I thought you were you, the one in control of the thoughts. But of course, that's a myth, but you can only find that out through experience. So, to wrap up, the idea of training your mind makes it so that there are basic components to every construction. So, racism, sexism, victimhood, seeing yourself a certain way, being a liar, all those identifications, they are developed through basic components of thoughts, feelings, perceptions. And there's a few more, but the main point is that they have basic components that do not need special a special approach. Like some people say, I have a special approach to trauma, especially if it's the kind with violence. When in reality, we're still talking about the same basic components that we can afford to deeply look at with a non-evaluative awareness. And so I encourage you to go and try this and try to be aware of your thoughts and your feelings as this comes up for you, and see the construction of what you've been calling, what you've been titling, what you've been labeling as racist or anti-racist or whatever that identification is. Try to see how it is bundled together into skandhas or heaps, and be able to look at it, meditate on it, and bring it into your everyday awareness, and see if that doesn't change your relationship with that identification, that racial or sexist or whatever it is. See if that doesn't really change your relationship to it, and even further, with further practice, see if it doesn't dissipate without needing this special approach or 20 steps or whatever it is to melt it. And be really committed to the non-evaluative awareness and see what happens. Thank you.